This morning I'll be reading from Matthew chapter 7, verse 24 through the end of the chapter. Matthew 7, starting in verse 24. Therefore, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain descended, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house. And it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. But everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain descended, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. And so it was when Jesus had ended these sayings that the people were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes.
In our study through the Sermon on the Mount, we have come to Jesus' conclusion of the sermon. And what I have titled this section of his sermon is the application and foundation of a Christian. And we've noticed many things throughout this sermon. We've noticed the teachings of Jesus, the warnings that Jesus gives to the Christian, the principles that we are to follow, just not only in our actions, but in our thoughts, what things that we are to think on, how we are to conduct ourselves, all the way back into the Beatitudes when Jesus starts the sermon. To summarize what leads up to his conclusion, he says, you must have this character to be in my kingdom. Chapter 5, verses 3 through 12. And this is what that character looks like in action, setting an example before others. That is the light and the salt. Chapter 5, verses 13 through 16. He says, I have come to show you how to do it properly by fulfilling the law. And you need to be proclaiming this about me, that is me fulfilling this law, and succeeding where the Pharisees have failed by living righteously. Chapter 5, verses 17 through 20. He then would go on to say, the way you do this, that is by living better than the Pharisees, is by first controlling your passions, fulfilling your oaths, and showing equality. Chapter 5, verses 21 to 48. And by being sincere in all that you do, not worrying about pleasing people, making money, or focusing on worldly goals. Chapter 6, verses 1 through 25. Therefore, he would say, do not worry about worldly materialistic things causing anxiety, but rather find peace in seeking after and investing in spiritual everlasting goals, and God will provide the rest. Chapter 6, verses 26 to 34. He then would say, the way you invest, he says, you need to invest, and he says, now let me show you what and how you should invest. The way you invest in heaven is by self-examining and discerning how to save souls according to God's standard. Chapter 7, verses 1 through 6. And showing a desire for a relationship with your Father, wanting to be in His house and holding on to His riches, which He wants to give you. Chapter 7, verses 7 through 11. Therefore, Jesus says, treat others the way you want to be treated, because God will reward you the same way you reward others. Chapter 7, verse 12. The only way you can receive this reward of eternal life is by walking the small and narrow path which few travel, not the broad and wide road which many travel. Chapter 7, verse 13 through 14. And he gives a warning. He says, beware of false teachers who try to lead you down this path. Chapter 7, verses 17 to 21. For just because they do or say stuff by my authority does not mean I approve it. Chapter 7, verses 22 to 23. Then he says, now, I've said all of these things. I have given you all of the instructions. Now, what are you going to do with it? Brethren, we have gone in depth on what Jesus has taught us concerning His kingdom. And this was just a summary of what He said. We've gone verse by verse, looking at everything that He has said that is required of us to be a part of the kingdom life. And now He says, now that you know everything that I've told you, what are you going to do with it? You've got two options, Jesus says. You can either be a wise man or you can be a foolish man. There's nothing in between. And he would say, starting in verse 24 to 25, in his conclusion, he says, there is assurance in wisdom, the assurance of the wise, consequences of building upon the rock, verses 24 to 25. After giving the positive route to follow, he then gives the negative route, verses 26 to 27. Abolishment of the foolish. You've got assurance of the wise, but now you've got the abolishment of the foolish. The consequences of building upon the sand, verses 26 to 27. And usually people would stop here. They would say, all right, that's the end of the sermon. Let's conclude and let's pack up and go to Bienenberger. All right. But there's a couple of verses after that a lot of people overlook. He then says that there's authority in what I am saying. The authority of the teacher. The consequences of standing before and hearing the master teacher. Now let's look at the positive route first. Okay? Let's look at the positive route first. Look at verses 24 to 25. He says, therefore, since I said all of these things, chapters 5, 6, and 7, he says, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house upon the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and slammed against that house, and yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Now, what I'd like to do to kind of give some further detail into this text is look at Luke's account. In Luke chapter 6, Luke also gives an account of Jesus' sermon, but he gives a different perspective, not changing any truth, but there's just certain things that stand out in Luke's account. Look at the way Luke phrases Jesus' description of the wise man. Luke chapter 6, verses 47 to 48. He says, everyone who comes to me and hears my words and acts on them, I will show you whom he is like. He is like a man building a house who dug deep and laid a foundation on the rock. And when a flood occurred, the torrent burst against that house, and it could not shake it because it was well built. Notice how he gives the same account and gives the same story, or parable, if you will, but there's certain descriptions that stand out in Luke's account versus Matthew's account. Now, if you put these together, look at what Jesus is saying. You've got, here we mentioned the main point number one, the consequences of building on the rock. Here are the consequences of building on the rock. You first are prudent. You are a prudent individual. We have wisdom in the word. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man. What's Luke's account of this? Anyone who comes to me and hears these words and acts. Notice how Luke gives a further description of the individual's actions. They're not just waiting around for Jesus to come to them. They come to Jesus first. They are actively seeking him out. And after they seek out Jesus, he says, after you have come to me and then heard my words and act on them, you will be a wise individual. You will be compared to one who is prudent. Now, if you read through the book of Proverbs, there's three different key words that are mentioned. You've got knowledge, you've got wisdom, and you've got prudence. Now, all three of these could be really, they can kind of get mixed in and merged and seen all as the same thing, and they're not. Knowledge is simply knowing something. It's just having knowledge of something. Wisdom is not only do I have the knowledge, but I know what to do with it. But notice how knowledge and wisdom, there's still no action yet. It's just I either know something or I know what to do with the knowledge that I have. Prudence, however, is acting upon the knowledge and wisdom that you have. Now, this Greek word here that Jesus uses to describe a wise man literally means prudent. one who acts on the knowledge and words that I have given him. If you can listen to it, you can have the knowledge, you can have the wisdom, but if you don't act on it, it's not going to do you any good. But the man who acts on these things, they are a prudent individual. Now, there are two different actions in Jesus' conclusion talking about the positive individual. Hearers and doers. How does one obtain the knowledge of Jesus the Christ? Well, Romans chapter 10 and verse 17 says, faith comes by hearing, and hearing by what? The Word of God. The NASB, the New American Standard Bible, 1995 would say the words of Christ. So how can I obtain faith and knowledge and wisdom? I must first hear Christ's words. Brethren, what have we been doing in the past few months? We have been listening to Christ's words. And he says, now that you have the knowledge and wisdom, it is up to you to produce the prudence. You know, who is the wisest man that we have record of that's not deity? Solomon. King Solomon. He wrote thousands of proverbs and thousands of psalms, and we only have very few of them recorded for us that the Lord inspired and said, I want this in my inspired book. We read about how throughout his entire reign there was peace, there was no war. He unified kingdoms, he taught the law, and it was all because he asked God for wisdom of how to lead God's people. But even though he had the knowledge, and even though he had the wisdom, what was it that he lacked? He lacked prudence. How do we know that he lacked prudence? We read about in the book of 1 Samuel, or 2 Samuel rather, and in the book of Ecclesiastes, how Solomon went to all of these things to try and find happiness, even though he had the knowledge and wisdom from God. Brethren, just because the wisdom of God is sitting in your head does not mean it's going to get you into heaven. It's got to get out of here and into your actions. It can't just be sitting on a bookshelf. It's got to be lived out. James would say, be doers of the word, not hearers only, deceiving your own selves. James chapter 1 and verse 22 through 25. He says, the demons fear and tremble. They believe. They have the knowledge of God. What makes you different than them? The difference is you actively live out God's word rather than just fearing it and having it in your head. Jesus says, if you do this, if you hear my words, if you do it, you will be a wise man, a wise individual, prudent. Proverbs chapter 1, verses 1 through 7 is the introduction to the entire book of Proverbs. And what it leads up to Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 7. And what does that passage say? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. But what despise wisdom and instruction? Fools. What does Jesus describe this next individual as who hates this wisdom from him? He describes him as a fool. But this individual is one who fears God because he's acting upon the word of God. The consequences of building on the rock is, number one, you are a prudent individual. He who hears these words and acts on them will be like a wise man. But in verse 25, we read about another consequence of building upon the rock. He says, you will be peaceful. You will be at peace. We have assurance through the storm, is what Jesus says. Look at verse 25. He says, and the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. You know, I know of an individual who loves storms, loves to actually chase them down. I believe that even my father, Ronnie Scherffius, growing up, when there would be a tornado come through, we had tornadoes a lot where we lived in Tennessee. When he heard that there would be a tornado, he would walk outside and try to find it. And his parents like, get inside. What's the matter with you? Are you trying to get caught up in the storm? Well, you see two different types of people. People who are afraid of the storm and people who either are ignorant or find peace within it. You know, something that we have for little Tommy when he goes to sleep is a storm machine, a little white noise machine, and there's an option for rain and thunder and lightning. You know, some people are terrified of storms, but some people, that's the way they go to sleep, is by listening to the storms. You know, as a Christian, we ought not to be afraid of the storms that comes our way. In fact, we should be like, bring it on. I've built my house on the rock. I've got no problem facing the issues that come my way because I'm built on a foundation that cannot shake. I'm at peace. Do you read of anybody in Scripture who found peace or was perhaps even sleeping during a storm? You know, somebody that comes to mind is Jesus the Christ himself. We read about how Jesus, in multiple passages, actually, Matthew chapter 8, right after his sermon, he sleeps through a storm. Mark chapter 4 and Luke chapter 8, we read about how Jesus is on the boat with his disciples out at sea, and there's a storm that comes about, and as everybody else is terrified, and they're trying to wake Jesus up, keeping from anybody from falling overboard, they're saying, Lord, how can you sleep through something like this? What was Jesus' response? Oh, ye of little faith. What, are you afraid that you're going to die when you've got deity in the boat with you? Sometimes we have God within our own household and we're still terrified. We ought not to be in such a state, brethren. If we have God on our side, we got no reason to be scared, to be anxious, to be worried that the world can overpower us, because who's the God of the storms? God. Jesus was able to calm that storm. He can calm your storm as well. But only if you heed his words and build upon the rock. You know, the psalmist had this exact same principle in his life that he lived out. In Psalm 3, verses 5 through 6, David would say, I lay down and slept. I awoke, for the Lord sustains me. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people who have set themselves against me round about. You know, David wrote this while he was being hunted by his own son, Absalom. And there was an army of Absalom that was trying to murder and slaughter David. And you know what David says? Even amongst war, even though I am a fugitive trying to look after my life from my son and his army, I can still go to sleep at night peacefully and wake up well-rested because the Lord sustains me. It does not matter what storm you're going through, brethren. If you have God, you can have peace. But you know, there's another consequence of building on the rock. It's not just being prudent. It's not just having peace, but you have perseverance as well. There's a reason that we can have peace and have the tranquility in life, but the only way we can have that is facing these trials and producing endurance and patience through Jesus the Christ. Look what Jesus says. The floods came and the winds blew, and yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Look what Luke says. He is like a man building a house who dug deep and laid a foundation on the rock. There's a few things that stand out to me about Luke's account of Jesus' sermon and his conclusion of this wise man and foolish man. He says he dug deep and laid. What does that indicate? It means, number one, he did not settle for something shallow. Brethren, do not settle. Do not settle for anything less than Jesus the Christ. If you are searching for the truth, and maybe you're even struggling trying to find the truth, and you're like, you know what, this is the closest thing. It doesn't satisfy me in the sense of, it doesn't, you know, it sounds 100% right and it's the truth, but it's close enough to the truth, so I'll just settle for this. Brethren, settling is not going to get you into heaven. You've got to dig deep. It requires work. It requires study. It requires perseverance on our part to dig deep, to find that good soil, to find that rocky foundation to lay our house on. And number one, he did not settle for something shallow. Number two, he worked diligently to try to find the right foundation. And number three, he was rewarded for what he built upon. Notice how in digging and searching and working hard and enduring, it was rewarded at the very end. There was a payoff at the very end. Man, I'm sure glad I built on this rock because, man, I didn't know that storm was going to be as bad as, it was way worse than I thought. But thankfully, I dug deep and I found rock and I built my house on it. You know, we read about a foundation. This foundation that Jesus discusses in Matthew chapter 7 is also mentioned in 1 Corinthians in more detail. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 3 with me. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, starting in verse 10, Paul is writing to the church at Corinth about a foundation that we need to be actively searching for. Now, in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, starting in verse 10, it says the following. According to the grace of God, which was given to me, like a wise master builder, I laid a foundation, and another is building on it. But each man must be careful how he builds on it. Look at verse 11. For no man can lay a foundation other than the one which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now, if any man builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each man's work will become evident. For the day will show it, because it is to be revealed with fire, and the fire itself will test the quality of each man's work. If any man's work which he has built on it remains, he will receive a reward. If any man's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved, yet as so through fire. Now, in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, we see this foundation that Jesus is describing in more detail. Well, what is this foundation? The foundation is Jesus himself. Look, Paul says, I laid a foundation, which is Jesus the Christ. I taught from the word. I laid a foundation for your faith, and others are building upon it. You know, before we build our faith, we must first establish a foundation. Before we put our faith in anything or anyone, we must first figure out what that thing or person is that we're putting our faith in. What does that mean, preacher? It means before I start building a house, I have to figure out the groundwork and I got to figure out the foundation. Jesus says, I have already given you the foundation. The foundation is me. I am that foundation. And if you try to lay any other foundation, it will be very evident that you did not follow my words. Because Jesus says in Matthew chapter 7, if you hear these words of mine and act upon them. So the foundation is the words of Christ. Well, you know, in John chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And if you read a few verses down in verse 14, it says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The Word, who is Jesus the Christ, should be our foundation. If we try to build on anything else, brethren, it's not going to look good. Jesus Christ is our foundation, according to 1 Corinthians. The foundation will withstand trials by fire, according to 1 Corinthians, and this foundation will reward those who build on it. Is that not exactly what Jesus says in his sermon and his conclusion? I am the foundation. If you build on me, you can withstand storms and there will be great rewards. But he gives another option. It's a negative one, but he says, look, I'm not going to force you to build on my foundation. If you don't want to, that's up to you. But just know that number 2, verses 26 to 27, there is going to be an abolishment of the foolish. The consequences of building on the sand. Now, let's read verses 26 to 27 together of Matthew chapter 7. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. In Luke's account, in Luke chapter 6, verses 46 to 49, Look how Luke describes the foolish man. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? Verse 49. But the one who has heard and has not acted accordingly is like a man who built a house on the ground without any foundation, and the torrent burst against it, and immediately it collapsed, and the ruin of that house was great. You know, before he leads into the idea of the wise man and the foolish man, he makes this statement, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do the things that I request of you? You know, Matthew says that, but in a little bit more words in verses 21 to 23 of chapter 7. Leading up to the wise man and the foolish man, it says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter. What I find fascinating about this foolish man is not only does the foolish man hear the words and not act on them, but there's a third thing that he's also doing. Even though he's heard the words and he has refused them, he still calls himself a Christian. Now that is what you call a fool. Somebody who hears the words of Almighty God, who knows what they're supposed to be doing, completely ignores it and disobeys those commands, and yet still says, I'm a follower of God. Jesus says, you really are a fool. If you truly say that you call me Lord, Lord, but not do the things that I request of you, you're a foolish man who doesn't even build on a foundation. It's not even that you build on the wrong foundation. It's you build on no foundation at all. You've got no security. There's nothing to keep you from withstanding the storm. What are the consequences of building on the sand, Jesus? This is what he says, verse 26. You are disobedient, number one. Rather than being prudent, you are disobedient. We will be foolish without the word. Look at Luke 6:46. Why do you call me Lord and do not do the things that I say? Look at the progression of this. You heard, you do not do, yet you call me your Lord. What kind of description of a person is this? This is a perfect description of what Jesus likes to call a hypocrite. In Matthew chapter 23, starting in verse 25 and going through verse 27, and the 8 woes that Jesus pronounces to the Pharisees, there are 2 of them that stick out, and they kind of go hand in hand. He says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like a dirty dish. You clean the outside of the cup, but there's still food and grime on the inside. From the outside, you look absolutely gorgeous and good enough to eat off of, but on the inside, you still have yesterday's lunch. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm going to eat something off of a dish, I want it clean. And I don't know if y'all have experienced this or not. Growing up with 6 siblings, we had to rotate through who did the dishes. And it was very fast to know who didn't do dishes very well. Because rather than cleaning it out on the inside with water and soap, what they would do is they would turn the water on, okay, it's clean, now throw it in. And it's worse when it's a straw or a spoon. And you go to get cereal and it's like, why does this taste like meatloaf? And then you realize this spoon is not clean. It was polished, it looks silver, it's perfect, but then you start to see some leftover supper from last night mixed in with your breakfast from this morning. Now that feeling that you have, that disgust, imagine how God feels. When you clean the outside and you profess to be a Christian, but on the inside he says, how can I accept you and being a follower when you haven't put in the work or being obedient to me in my word? You're like a dirty dish that nobody wants to eat out of but loves to look at. And if they are tricked into eating with it, then they're disgusted. They almost want to vomit. Jesus says, you're that kind of individual. You are a fool. You're disgusting inside and out. He also gives another description in verse 27 of Matthew chapter 23. He says, not only are you like a dirty dish, but you're also like a whitewashed tomb. I know of some people who travel the world to look at tombstones and things of that nature pertaining to their family. And they love to go and look at and pay respects to their family. And those tombs are clean and they're pristine because they're always polished marble. It's it's putrid, it's death, it's decay. Jesus says, you may look good on the outside, you may be polished and pristine, but on the inside, you are what is the definition of sin, your death. Jesus says, if you listen to my words, but yet you do not act upon them and you profess to be a Christian, you are a foolish individual. You are disobedient. And he says, but not only are you a disobedient individual, but you are full of disorder. You're full of chaos. We have uncertainty through the storm. Look at verse 27. The rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and slammed against that house. When your house is built on an untrustworthy foundation, you have a few problems. You've got that the foundation shifts, nothing is well built, and there is constant anxiety and fear that will happen of what will happen next. You know, I knew a man who had his own construction company, and he produced his own recipe, as he called it, for concrete. It was a great recipe that was strong and would actually get stronger over time. Well, there were some of his workers that tried to do a rush job and they didn't mix it well. And he knew exactly what it looked like and what it was not supposed to look like. And when he came up on the job, he said, now hang on a minute, why are y'all starting the framework? This concrete isn't right. They said, well, we didn't have a few of the materials, but went ahead and mixed it and added something that was very similar to what we were supposed to have, but it'll work. Trust us. We've done this before. He says, no, you're going to break up this concrete. You're going to redo all of it because you're not going to build a house on an unstable foundation. Brethren, if we try to build our faith on something that really isn't even a foundation, why do we expect it to go through a storm when we haven't put in the work and effort to dig deep and find the right foundation? Because there's no getting around the storm. The storm's coming. And it's a matter of, are we ready for it or are we not? If we've been disobedient, then brethren, our faith is going to be absolutely useless. Our foundation is going to shake. And it does not matter how well built the house is. If the foundation crumbles, everything on top falls with it. And that's exactly what Jesus is saying. If you do not put me as the foundation and the cornerstone of your life, everything above the foundation, your entire life, doesn't matter how well you built your life up, it doesn't matter how rich you are, how much reputation you have, it does not matter how much money or how many children or how well the job that you started, whatever it may be, it does not matter how good your life is. If your spiritual life, your foundation is not what it needs to be, everything else is going to fall. Jesus says, do not be like the foolish man who has uncertainty, who's disobedient, and in verse 27, who faces destruction. That's a consequence of building on the sand. And it fell, and great was its fall. You know, the word fell, literally to fail. Not fail, fall in the sense of falling, but failed in the sense of I did not succeed. Jesus says, and great was its failure. Not only did it just fall, but it failed. It was unsuccessful. And you know what this word great means? It literally means to be loud. He says, and when the storms came and the winds blew and the floods beat up against the house failed and it was very loud. What he's saying is, brethren, on the day of judgment, if our foundation is not what it needs to be, our failure will be so great that everybody will hear it. Do we really want to stand before Jehovah God and Him ring out throughout all of creation and all of the souls that stand before Him, Anthony Scherffius failed? I don't want that said about me. What I want to hear is, Anthony is a wise man because he built on my words. He built on Jesus the Christ. He was obedient. But brethren, the only way I can hear those words from God is if I do those things. And same thing for you. And you know, this is where we would usually stop the sermon because this is where Jesus ends. It just cuts off. And great was the fall of it. It's almost like Jesus says, and great was the failure of the foolish man, and then just walks away. But we read about the response of the great multitude. Look at verses 28 to 29, the authority of the teacher. When Jesus had finished these words, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority and not as their scribes. We read about Jesus having authority in his teaching 3 times in the book of Matthew, Matthew 7, Matthew 13, and Matthew 22. It's also mentioned in the book of Mark 3 different times, Mark chapter 1, Mark chapter 6, and Mark chapter 11. And it's also mentioned once in the other 2 gospel accounts, Luke chapter 4 and John chapter 7. It was made known that when Jesus taught, he taught with authority and he taught with power and he did not let up. He didn't come across as somebody who was timid or, you really should be doing this, but it's really up to you. That wasn't Jesus. Jesus said, either you do this or you go to hell, period. Well, Jesus, that's kind of harsh. Yes, it's harsh, but I'm trying to ingrain into your brains that you have an eternal soul. And if you do not act upon my words, you will not get your reward. And I want you to get your reward. I'm not going to beat around the bush, Jesus says. I'm going to tell you like it is, in love, of course, but you need to hear the truth. I'm not going to judge you on the day of judgment and you not have any chance to hear the truth. I want to make sure that you know the truth and that the truth can set you free if you are steadfast and unmovable. They were amazed at his teaching. All were amazed. Jesus' teaching was unique and stood out for a couple of reasons. Why was Jesus' teaching so unique? He taught something different than what mankind had taught. And he taught with authority and power behind his messages. Jesus preached like a king. You had the Pharisees and the scribes. They would preach in such a way that would uplift themselves, but Jesus taught in a way that was full of authority, that was almost like listening to a king himself, coming down from his throne to tell his subjects what they need to be doing, and then he showed them how to do it. That's because that's exactly what Jesus is. It's a king who left behind an example for us to follow. And then in verse 29, not only were they amazed at his teaching, but it was authority in his teaching. Matthew 28, verses 18 through 20, all authority is given to me. That's why he had such authority in his teaching, is because he had all authority. Where did he get it? From God the Father, from heaven and on earth. Jesus could teach in such a way that showed his authority in the physical realm and in the spiritual realm. He says, I'm telling you what you need to do because I created you. I created the system of how to be saved. And if you do not follow this, the only way, you're going to be lost. And notice this, and not as their scribes. How did they teach? If Jesus taught like a king with authority, what did they teach like? They taught shallow teaching. They taught hypocritical teaching. They taught selfish teaching. They taught perverted teaching. That is, they perverted the law to mean something that they wanted. They taught demonic teaching. James chapter 3. This wisdom is not from heaven above. It's from below, which is earthly and demonic and impure. And they taught earthly and corruptible teaching. Jesus, in his teaching of the Sermon on the Mount, he teaches us how to live in his kingdom. He says you've got to have the right attitude. You've got to obey the right law, and you've got to do it with my approval, with my authority. And he says, now that you know what to do, what are you going to do? Remember how he ends the sermon. He doesn't say, come now, as together we stand and as we sing. How does he end the sermon? He says, what are you going to do with it? Either you obey it and you're a wise man, you're rewarded, or you're a fool. You are somebody who says there is no God, and then he just leaves. Look at the authority behind that. Brethren, what are you going to do with that message? Are you going to examine yourself and say, you know what? I have not been building on the foundation that I need to be building upon. I've been trying to find other satisfactory foundations that aren't living up to the standard of Jesus the Christ, and I need to change my foundation? Or are you like the Pharisees, who are blind leaders of the blind, who think that I can be my own foundation, and your righteousness is not exceeding that of the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees? Or maybe, just maybe, you're like the prophets who were before you in Matthew chapter 5, verses 10 through 12. And so they persecuted the prophets who were before you, because you're living out exactly what Jesus is saying, but it's hard and there's a storm and it feels like you want to give up, but you need prayers for strength to continue on the foundation that you have built upon, which is Jesus the Christ. Whatever it may be, I beg and plead that you come now as together we stand and as we sing.
Christ.